Thank you very much, Jenny. I'm both delighted and honoured to be speaking to everyone this evening, and what a wonderful turnout. So I do hope this is a most fruitful session. Many of you will be aware of Madame Blavatsky's famous statement, "There is a road, steep and thorny, beset with perils of every kind, but yet a road, and it leads to the very heart of the universe." The road steep and thorny is what we describe as the path of return, or spiritual path. Theosophy symbolizes the spiritual path as a mountainous ascent, the mountain of initiation. We describe 5 major initiations prior to liberation from the wheel of rebirth, each of these conferring increasingly greater expansions of consciousness and an enhanced capacity to express the divine life force. When we decide to tread the path, we have a choice. There are 2 paths, as is stated in the voice of the silence. We can explore and express our creative potential, which is itself a challenging process, or we can fast track our evolution by ascending the symbolic cliff face. If we undertake this route, we will undergo greater and considerably more arduous tests and trials. When we undertake this particular route in pursuit of the magnificent vistas which open up to us in the form of expansions in our consciousness, we are compacting the learning experiences of many lives into a short few. And just as a mountaineer is prepared even to persist in the face of inclement circumstances, in the form of freezing cold temperatures and raging blizzards, so we must persevere in our spiritual efforts, in the knowledge that our efforts are of benefit to humanity and the planetary consciousness as a whole. Also importantly, when we tread the path, we must bear in mind that the journey is the goal. It is the experiences along the way which result in expansions in our consciousness and elevations in our level of being. Capricorn is the zodiacal sign which rules spiritual initiation. And in a manner akin to the mountain goat, when we seek to ascend the symbolic cliff face of the mountain of initiation, we will be challenged towards progressing in a stealthy but assured manner. And there will be times when we symbolically cling onto a narrow precipice whilst all around us is crumbling. The astrological sign of Capricorn and its ruling planet Saturn govern patience and endurance, burdens, difficulties, isolation, long delays, also self-discipline, responsibility, and success of an enduring nature. And these are hallmarks of the spiritual initiate in the form of the qualities that they demonstrate and the experiences which they have undergone. Capricorn and Saturn also rule synthesis and personality integration, these being most necessary if we are going to be infused by the energies of the soul. Each zodiacal sign possesses a key phrase. The one associated with Capricorn is that of "I use." And when treading the path, we must utilize our various experiences in life, both objective and subjective, so that we may create a personality structure capable of being infused by the energies and qualities of the soul. A mountaineer would seek to undertake adequate preparation before embarking upon their ascent of a most challenging summit. They would ensure that they had undertaken the requisite physical training, that they possessed the correct equipment, they were sufficiently aware of the nature of the terrain, the expectant climatic conditions, and so on. And similarly, when we tread the path, we must be adequately equipped, both in terms of our life experience and in terms of the knowledge of what we are actually seeking to achieve. It is essential that we are aware of the disciplines of the path and their resultant effects upon our psyche as we seek to connect with and express the intent of the soul. We must understand our psychological dynamics, our relationship to the subjective realms of consciousness. We must ally the factor of self-discipline to our spiritual aspiration as a means of enabling us to persist in our efforts as we tread the razor-edge path between the outer and the inner world. And we must be aware that the higher self will test us to ascertain our worthiness as its spiritual instrument, whilst it will also seek to dispense more rapidly with the pool of karma which has accumulated over our previous incarnations. Theosophy informs us that in essence we are indivisible sparks of the divine, monads, seen here at the top of this two-dimensional diagram of the 7 planes of consciousness. Due to the purity of its vibration, the monad cannot itself descend beneath its own level of being. Rather, it adopts the soul as a mechanism of expression so that it may function upon the planes of consciousness below its own. So what we call the soul or higher self, depicted here as an upright facing triangle, serves as the instrument of the monad. The soul is seeking to acquire a complete form of consciousness whereby it is responsive to the vibrations of life on every level of being. And it's only upon successfully learning every experience that life in human form has to offer via its instrument, the personality, that the soul is then released from the wheel of rebirth. This process enables the monad to obtain its objective during its long evolutionary sojourn. It is seeking to acquire what we refer to as spiritual staying power, this being the ability to radiate and express its latent qualities despite the many challenges and constraints imposed upon it through physical incarnation. In his work, Psychology and Alchemy, Carl Jung likens the higher self, the soul, to a crystal lattice, present as a potential form in solution, and which first comes visible in the process of crystallization, although such crystallization may not necessarily occur. And this is very good symbolism in that the higher self is not complete, but present within us all as a potentiality. We manifest the higher self through a specific process, that is, undertaking the tried and tested disciplines of the spiritual path, whereby we function as a spiritual instrument, expressing the qualities of the higher self in our everyday lives. Emma Jung and Marie-Louise von Franz state in this respect, how and by what means can the self, or higher self, become manifest? It is realized to the extent in which it is lived in the experience of daily life. This is very important. We come into incarnation to develop and express the qualities of the soul, not to negate our experience in matter. As personalities, we function as the soul's instrument. The personality is chosen in accord with the intent of the soul, and therefore we should accept our circumstances in life as appropriate to the great evolutionary purpose. The word personality is derived from the Latin word persona, meaning that through which the sound comes, or the instrument through which the higher self is seeking to sound its own particular note. The Latin word persona describes the mask worn by ancient Greek and Roman actors, which indicated the particular role that they were playing. And of course, this is a very apt description for the soul's mechanism. Indeed, when we consider all of the forms in the material world, we may view these as masks which obscure the one divine life that is both immanent within all forms, yet also transcendent of its own creation. I'm going to read you a verse from fragment 1 of Madame Blavatsky's classic, The Voice of the Silence. Before the soul can comprehend and may remember, She must unto the silent speaker be united, just as the form to which the clay is modelled is first united with the potter's mind. The symbol of the soul as the potter, moulding the clay of the personality upon the wheel of rebirth, is especially apt. Of course, it takes many, many lives for the higher self to fashion a suitable instrument of expression in the material world. Let us consider an analogy here of the soul seeking to create an urn, a receptacle which can then dispense its spiritual energies, as the clay of its successive personalities is modelled upon the rotating wheel of rebirth. At the present stage of human evolution, most of humanity may be described as urns in the making. Each member of the human kingdom is going through this process whereby the soft, malleable, symbolic clay is being gradually molded into a structure which accords with and is aligned to the intent of the higher self. Throughout the course of our many incarnations around the zodiacal wheel, we are slowly molded into a suitable receptacle for spiritual energy. We are driven around the zodiac life after life by our various desires. These enable spirit to become fully immersed in matter as part of a vast evolutionary design. The zodiacal wheel will rotate many times before our personality vehicles, what we refer to as the physical, astral, and mental bodies, are fused into a coherent and integrated structure which can serve as an instrument of the soul. In early incarnations, we learn by trial and error as we gradually develop the capacity to distinguish between right and wrong. At a much later stage, the personality, as the instrument of the soul, experiences what we refer to as divine unrest. This is where the transient affairs of everyday life no longer satisfy nor sustain one. One looks for something more, and this is when the spiritual path beckons. Then we are challenged to discriminate between the real and the unreal. That is what is truly spiritual and what is illusory, as we seek to realize that we are essentially immortal, an aspect of the one divine life, and to base our efforts and endeavors in life upon this great truth. Returning to the urn analogy, as we are slowly and progressively molded into a suitable receptacle of spiritual energy, we become eligible for the next stage of the evolutionary process. This occurs when the symbolic urn of personality has been suitably shaped and molded whereby it may hold the waters of life after it has been suitably fired. The urn must be placed in a kiln, representing the burning ground of spiritual initiation. It is then rendered capable of usefully applying the spiritual waters of the causal realms of consciousness towards assisting the evolutionary plan. Prior to this, the waters of the emotions seek through its earthen structure. This is when the compositional structure of the urn is unable to retain the subtle vapors of the mind, let alone the energies of the planes of consciousness where the soul is found. So an urn must be fired, and before the firing occurs, it must be glazed. This is representative of our existential role within the evolutionary process. We've all undergone our own unique experiences over our many incarnations. And importantly, as souls, we each come into incarnation to implement a part of the evolutionary plan. So the urn must be glazed over and fashioned, fired, and then it will receive the spiritual waters and pour them out in its own specific way in accordance with the conditions of the Aquarian age. It's only when the urn is fired, when the neophyte undergoes the higher initiations, that it can then pour out these spiritual energies. This is when one becomes an exemplar of the process of spiritual transformation. And of course, we witness this in the lives of great souls who have passed before us, including Gautama Buddha, Socrates, Plato, Jesus of Nazareth, Shankara, Madame Blavatsky, Paramahansa Yogananda. So although it is formless, the wisdom teachings symbolize the soul as a lotus-like structure, seeking to unfold its symbolic petals of knowledge, love, and sacrifice. This being achieved through the interrelated practices of study, meditation, and spiritual service. The symbolism of the lotus as a representation of the soul is not arbitrary. The lotus has its roots in the earth, representing our physical body or our earthly base. The stem of the lotus extends up through the water, symbolizing the astral or emotional level of our being. And the lotus flower opens above in the air at the level of the mind. Thus, its importance is emphasized in terms of our spiritual growth. Mahayana Buddhism talks of Sakavati, the realm of bliss. Sakavati is described as a lake containing many lotuses, with these representing the souls of humanity. This equates with the theosophical concept of Devachan. The lotuses are at varying stages in terms of the opening of their petals and their ultimate flowering. Some are fully opened, displaying their beauty, emitting their fragrance, whilst others are at the stage of budding. The wisdom teachings inform us that the flower of the soul forms a bud in the case of a young soul. An opening lotus with 3 tiers of petals is one who is treading the path, and a resplendent blossom containing a blazing radiant jewel in the lotus in the spiritual initiate. The symbolic lotus flower opens through its exposure to the rays of the sun, the symbol for our spiritual essence, the monad. And the fact that the lotus flowers above the water suggests that we must develop the capacity to operate at a level beyond that of the emotions or above that of the emotions. Thereby we avoid what the Hindus refer to as karma manas, or mind contaminated by desire. It is desire which binds us to the wheel of rebirth and to the mire of the lower worlds. Desire arises through our attachments to the transient objects and circumstances of the material world. And we cannot fully express the immortal aspect of our being if our efforts in life are based upon, driven by, the pursuit of matters of an impermanent nature. And this is a very important consideration when we tread the spiritual path. We seek liberation from the hegemony of the astral body and its associated desires. As I implied earlier, desire is healthy for the developing soul, seeking for its personality to become more engaged with the material world. But for one treading the spiritual path, desire must be overcome, transmuted into aspiration for matters of an eternal nature. And by overcoming karma manas, or mind driven by desire, mind entangled with the emotions, we elevate the mind towards the higher planes of Atma and Buddhi, divine persistent will, love wisely applied, wisdom lovingly applied. This is how we are able to function as a spiritual instrument. This is achieved through the undertaking of study, meditation, service, and by expressing the energies of the spiritual planes of the soul, which Plato described as truth, beauty, and goodness. The voice of the silent states, kill out desire, but if thou killest it, take heed lest from the dead it should again rise. Kill love of life, but if thou slayest tanha, thirst, let this not be for thirst of life eternal, but to replace the fleeting by the everlasting. not yet, sorry. And when we tread the path, then, a major emphasis is placed upon control of the emotions and transmutation of our various desires. The energies of the astral plane are focused upon the solar plexus chakra, located in the abdominal region. The astral body will synthesize these forces, whereby we may then use them effectively, whether it is towards personal ends, including the fulfillment of various desires, or when treading the path for the purpose of assisting the processes of evolution through creativity and spiritual expression. And the key towards the latter is through transmuting the energies of the solar plexus chakra into those of the heart chakra, its higher counterpart. And towards these ends, we seek to express heart chakra qualities which relate to what theosophy refers to as the Buddhic plane. We seek to express unconditional and inclusive forms of love, as opposed to the selfish or jealous love orchestrated at an astral level. It is worth stating here that this does not mean that love of a personal nature is eliminated, but rather the love is extended outwards to the degree where it eventually becomes universal. Other heart chakra qualities are compassion and empathy. We must strive to recognize, understand the situations of others and the various challenges which they face as souls in incarnation. I live in a declining industrial city. I often see homeless people on the street. I personally think homelessness is a tremendous blight on our society. And of course, I see these people as souls in incarnation, and the trusted aphorism, "But for the grace of God go I," resonates very powerfully. Another heart chakra quality which is very important is that of harmlessness. We say harmlessness in thought, word, and deed. And harmlessness serves as a particularly effective antidote towards creating further difficult karma when we are confronted by life's challenges. And importantly, harmlessness also serves to promote right human relations. Another heart chakra quality is that of discrimination. This relates to the ability to discriminate between the real and the unreal, which I mentioned earlier, or the spiritual and the transient. We must also demonstrate the courage of the questing heroes of myth when we tread the path. Courage is a heart chakra quality, and this provides us with the means of overcoming fear, which is centered in the solar plexus chakra. Courage is a most important quality when we tread the path, as we will face many challenges and obstacles, and we will also be forced to confront our lower nature and its accumulated effects over our many previous lives in the form of what we refer to as the dweller on the threshold. The dweller represents the sum total of our lower nature, of which the effects have been created over our many lives. The dweller is the aggregation of our fears and the repressed and undesirable aspects of our character. The dweller is only dispatched at what theosophy describes as the third initiation, when the symbolic mountain has been successfully scaled. The dweller is then replaced by what we refer to as the angel of the presence, representation of the soul. The dweller forms the vortex of a force field, the spiritual aspirant being the positive and donating pole, and the dweller the negative one. And to overcome the dweller, we must focus and concentrate our energies on our spiritual objectives. This weakens and strangulates the dweller as it causes its energy supply to cease. But we must be aware when treading the path, there will be many battles with our lower nature. I can certainly vouch for that. And although we may achieve many victories in this battle with the dweller will seek to reassert itself. It will highlight challenging situations in our lives as a means of reasserting its authority. Here is an image of the Greek hero Hercules fighting the Hydra, which is a dweller symbol. Any of you who are familiar with the myth will be aware that one of the Hydra's 9 heads is immortal. And when Hercules overcomes the Hydra, some versions say he holds it up to the light and it withers, a symbol for the light of the soul. And others say that he cuts off the 8 heads and they are cauterized, emphasizing strength of will and the importance of will in the spiritual process. In both versions, the immortal head is buried under a rock. And this informs us symbolically that the effects of the dweller remain until the 3rd initiation. And the burying it under a rock is symbolic of the fact that we must seek to refine and purify our vibrations and not engage in any thoughts or incidents related to low-grade astral substance. I mentioned earlier the requirement of psychological integration, where the physical, astral, and mental bodies function as one. This is very important. This enables us to focus upon our spiritual objectives without being distracted. We are then not bound to the lower worlds by our attachments and desires. We can function in accordance with the intent of the soul. Also, we must be psychologically integrated to deal with the various forces of the inner worlds and what Jung calls the unconscious. And also if we are going to withstand the burning ground of initiation. Spiritual purification is very important. Indian teachings often symbolize the personality as a mirror clouded by personality tendencies, which they refer to as vasanas. These are carried over from previous lives by means of what the Indian teachers call samskaras. And it is these vasanas or tendencies which give rise to vrittis or thoughts which are entangled with desire. But these teachings inform us that the symbolic mirror must be cleansed so that it can reflect the light of the Atman, the equivalent to the higher self as the instrument of the monad. So this is a very important process when treading the spiritual path. Self-analysis, deciding what requires purifying or eliminated within our psyche, and then going about its removal so we may reflect the light of the soul. The voice of the silence offers warning against one treading the path lacking in purity and psychological integration. Beware lest thou shouldest set a foot still soiled upon the ladder's lowest rung. Woe unto him who dares pollute one rung with miry feet. The foul and viscous mud will dry, become tenacious, then glue his feet unto the spot, and like a bird caught in the wily fowler's line, he will be stayed from further progress. His vices will take shape and drag him down. His sins will raise their voices like as the jackals laugh and sob after the sun goes down. His thoughts become an army and bear him off a captive slave. Some really beautiful metaphors in that particular verse. Here is an image of the Italian psychiatrist Roberto Assagioli, who was very heavily influenced by theosophical teachings. Indeed, his wife and his mother were both theosophists. He described the process of spiritual transformation in his concept of psychosynthesis, the objective here being what he referred to as self-realization. And as a means of effecting this, the individual must purify and integrate the components of the personality as I've said, mental, astral, and physical bodies, into a coherent structure which can be infused by the energies of the soul. Psychosynthesis, which is a reflection of treading the path, or an expression rather of treading the path, entails our existing personality with its various attitudes, predispositions, complexes, attachments, and desires being effectively deconstructed and thereafter reassembled at a higher point of consciousness. It is only then that we can function in an integrated way whereby we are safely and successfully energized by the soul. The medieval alchemists reflected this in their motto, Solve et coagula. Solve referring to the breaking down of components, and coagula relating to their reconstitution in a more purified form. This enables the alchemist to attain the philosopher's stone, which is a symbol of the awakened higher self, but it is only through this process of purification. And of course, this is a most challenging process. In the Bhagavad Gita, we may view the battlefield of Kurukshetra as a symbol of the confrontation between the higher and lower nature of the neophyte. The higher nature is represented by the good and righteous Pandava army, whereas their enemies, the Kauravas, symbolize instinctual, desire-driven components of the psyche. The protagonist, the Pandava Arjuna, is initially petrified at the prospect of having to confront teachers, friends, and relatives who are assembled amongst the enemy ranks. What does this mean symbolically? Well, when we tread the path, there are aspects of our psyche which serve as impediments to spiritual progress, which therefore require removal or transmutation. And some of these we may hold dear, but they still must be removed if we are to proceed further on our symbolic mountainous ascent. In the Bhagavad Gita, as many of you will know, it is the charioteer Krishna, an incarnation of the god Vishnu, who offers Arjuna advice, which infuses him with the necessary knowledge and courage to engage in the righteous and necessary conflict. There is a particularly famous address in chapter 2, verse 47, where in summary, Arjuna is advised to act without regard for the fruits of his actions, to avoid identification with action, and to dedicate his actions to Brahman, the transcendent reality. And in simple terms, he is being informed to function purely as an instrument of the soul and to get the ego completely out of the way. When we tread the path, we can take an important step on our journey by recognizing that everything comes from within and that the innermost aspect of our being, the monad, is divine, and emanating from this divine source are qualities such as love, altruism, aspiration, wisdom, compassion, and self-sacrifice, and indeed, all factors which can serve to ennoble humanity. When we tread the path, we are advised of the need to cultivate virtue before we ascend to the pinnacle of human consciousness. The first two limbs of Patanjali's Yoga Sutras refer to yamas and niyamas. These may be described respectively as universal morality and personal observances. So the yamas, or universal morality, describes the requirement of harmlessness and compassion for all living things. I mentioned this earlier, of course, as a heart chakra qualities. Truthfulness, non-stealing, including that which is not freely given to us, such as the time and efforts of others. Control of the senses. This entails disciplining our imagination, as it is our imagination which invokes a desire nature. neutralizing desire and our require to hoard wealth or acquire wealth. And to be free of all attachments, we must realize that the only constants on our spiritual journey, the symbolic ascent of the cliff face, are impermanence and change. The personal observances, or niyamas, relate to purity of the body, emotions, and mind. Negative factors such as passion, anger, lust, greed, pride, and delusion must be eliminated. We must be content with our lot in life. There is a beautiful Christian aphorism: love where you are, who you are with, and what you are doing. We must be aware that the soul places us in different situations in our lives, situations which are appropriate not just for our own spiritual growth, but for the evolution of all. We must engage in self-analysis, as I mentioned, being aware of our faults and limitations, seeking to transmute vices into virtues, and celebrating the spiritual, the transcendent principle which underlies all creation, being aware there is an omnipresent, omnipotent, omniscient force which is guiding and directing not only our lives, but the entire evolutionary process. I've said a little bit about the human constitution and the need to overcome desire. The lower mind or mental body, which we see here, lower mental, is the most subtle of our personality vehicles. It is derived from the substance of the mental world, the four lowest of the mental subplanes. And it is the thought processes of the mind which enable us to function effectively in the physical world. However, from a spiritual perspective, the mind represents a limitation. As Madame Blavatsky states in The Voice of the Silence, the mind is the slayer of the real. Let the disciple slay the slayer. The mind is constantly in movements. Its chattering deafens us to the inner voice of the soul. In Buddhism, the undisciplined mind is metaphorically described as a chattering monkey due to its restless and unsettled nature. Of course, the mind is constantly moving, continually assuming the forms and colors of that which is presented to it, whether this is through our five senses, our imagination, our emotions, or our memory, or combinations of these. And in the vast majority of humanity, most thoughts are driven by the astral body as a means of satisfying various desires. This, of course, being the karma manas I'm referring to, or I've referred to earlier. The teachings of Advaita Vedanta employ the analogy of a pond being rippled by the wind to describe the machinations of the lower mind and its fascination with the objects of the outer world. When the wind causes ripples in the water, only broken images of the objects surrounding the pond can be seen as reflections. However, if the water is stilled, then the image of the objects encircling the pond can be perceived in its entirety, and we can see beneath the surface. And the vast majority of humanity incorrectly identify with splintered images flickering on the pond surface. And when we practice meditation, in accordance with the great yoga teachings, we are seeking to still the symbolic waters of the pond so that we may perceive life in its entirety, perceive our underlying divine essence. And the lower mind is anchored to the physical world of duality. It understands the objects and circumstances of our world through comparison, and it's therefore continually caught between the opposites, which are largely self-created. Spiritual truth embraces rather than separates between opposites here, because spiritual truth is not found on the level of duality, but by the experience of the underlying oneness. In terms of mythological symbolism, we are challenged, like the classical hero Jason, in pursuit of the golden fleece, a symbol of the higher self, to sail beyond the Symplegades, the clashing rocks, which you see here, this symbolizing the opposites of manifestation. And when we seek spiritual transformation, it's important to be aware that matters in life which are very testing to the personality are equally elevating to the soul. Adversity represents opportunity. And we're reminded here of Shakespeare's famous lines in As You Like It. Sweet are the uses of adversity, which like the toad, ugly and venomous, wears yet a precious jewel in his head. And this our life, exempt from public haunt, finds tongues in trees, books in the running brooks, sermons in stones, and good in everything. When we experience challenges, adverse circumstances in our lives, we are offered the opportunity to express divine persistent will. This is an important factor when treading the path, and we must accept life's various challenges in an appropriate way. They serve to test us within the crucible of human experience, offering us the opportunity towards enhancing our spiritual growth. In a manner akin to the symbolic mountaineer, whom I mentioned earlier, the mountaineer, he or she is prepared to persist in the face of inclement circumstances. And we must do likewise in pursuit of higher states of consciousness, doing so in the knowledge that our efforts are of the benefit to humanity and the planetary consciousness as a whole. So we should be alive to the opportunities presented to us when we are challenged. And also to be aware that spiritual development is achieved by virtue of our efforts and the purity of our motives, and that spiritual growth occurs at great depth. It is not necessarily seen on the surface of life. I have often experienced challenges in my life. When I was aged about 30, I was at university as a mature student. After first year, I was kicking myself that I didn't go there 6 or 7 years earlier as I planned to, but it was going very, very well. I had, well, you'd have to say outstanding marks, which wasn't that difficult if you're used to full-time work and disciplining yourself. But anyway, I took ill with Guillain-Barré syndrome and suffered bouts of paralysis. My nerves felt as if they were on fire, and this completely stopped me in my tracks. And yes, I could see the spiritual side of it. I was a regular meditator, but it was almost as if the illness was designed to test me, not just to test me, but almost to defeat me in that respect, where the lower nature would have its say. It was almost as if I hadn't done enough exploration, enough working on myself there. But I do remember one of my student friends was a very spiritual person, and she said, "Oh, it's a great opportunity, Gary." And in times when I felt very low, I thought to myself, people who are saying that, would they be so happy in taking it on? You know, that was obviously little Gary speaking and not big Gary. So use of the will, the ability to persist, this is at the core of Assagioli's psychosynthesis. He emphasizes the correct use of the will. And as well as persisting when we are challenged through circumstances in the outer world, using the will, we must also use the will to subjugate the personality to the intent of the soul, overcoming our attachments, whether physical, emotional, or mental. So I've been saying quite a bit about the spiritual path. I've emphasized that our personality must be fully integrated, that we must shake off our emotional attachments, express courage, relinquish fear, and transmute the desires of the personality into spiritual aspiration. We must discriminate between the real and the unreal, so we are not driven by Maya-based consideration. I'm going to say a little bit now about communication with the higher self. How do we obtain guidance and direction from within? By what means does the immortal aspect of our being convey its intent to us? And in what language? Plato described a world of ideas, and in theosophy we talk of higher manas, or abstract thought, which we develop through studying the wisdom teachings, through studying the arts, philosophy, and especially through interpreting symbolism, whether these are the ideographs found in alchemy, Egyptian writings, and so on, whether it is the symbolism of myth or the imagery associated with dreams and meditation. And this assists us to build a bridge to the higher worlds, which of course in theosophy we refer to as the Antakarana. It is the Antakarana which links the lower and higher selves. It serves to increasingly channel the energies of the soul into the aura of the personality, suffusing it with spiritual qualities. And of course, these have been hard won, both in the life in question and in previous lives, where they have passed from the personality up the Antakarana to be held by the higher self for future use. And it is by means of the Antakarana that communication can occur between soul and personality. Carl Jung stated that archetypes, or divine ideas, are represented within the human psyche as symbols. Theosophy would state that the archetypes are in essence the intent of the great solar consciousness, which we are a part of, hence the term divine ideas. They are represented within the human psyche as symbols, and they surface in our consciousness in symbolic form through dreams, meditations, and the occurrence of synchronicities. By that I mean where there's a concurrence between the inner psyche, or our subjective nature, and events in the outer objective world. Jung illustrated that many dreams present us with images and associations analogous to primitive ideas, myths, and rites. These, of course, are based upon early attempts of humanity to understand and to utilize the energies of the archetypes. And Jung emphasized that symbols offered to us through dreams are natural attempts to reconcile and unite the opposites within the psyche. Ultimately, this leads us to a level of being which transcends the dualistic nature of the manifest world. Of course, Jung described the spiritual quest in his concept of individuation, which really reflects the higher initiations of theosophy, as does the psychosynthesis of Assagioli. So our psyche possesses a symbol-making propensity. Human consciousness serves the purpose of not merely recognizing and assimilating what's out there in the world via the five senses, but it uses these sights and experiences to translate into visible reality the contents of the worlds within. We can only experience within what we have experienced out there. Symbols are spontaneous products of the psyche. Jung emphasized that we do not create our symbols, but we discover them. What he's meaning is the personality doesn't just create the symbols, they come from a higher level. And what he's saying in essence is that the soul communicates with us through symbols. It can help greatly to keep what is referred to as a spiritual diary, a record of our dreams, our meditations, our spiritual efforts, and to ask questions, put questions to the soul via our spiritual diary and await symbolic feedback. This can be of great value. Of course, dream interpretation is not easy. I personally would not recommend a dreamer's dictionary. There's a marked contextual element to our dreams. It's based upon our own experience. And dream interpretation can vary. The soul may be trying to tell us something about our astral body or our mind, our attitudes, or it may be offering to give us direction in life. And of course, symbols are very fluid and they have existential meaning. And the same symbol can mean different things to the one who perceives it. Here is an image on the left of the Roman Mercury, the psychopomp or guide of souls. This is a symbol of the aspect of the higher self which communicates with us, the messenger of the gods. The Egyptians had Thoth, the wisdom god, and the Hindus had Ganesha, the removal of obstacles. It's just really ways of portraying how we receive communications from within via the higher self and how we are assisted on the path. And we all have our own existential inner symbols. There will be instances in our subjective lives where we're offered very personal symbols. Perhaps someone from our childhood keeps popping up in our dreams, and the challenge for us is to recognize what this symbol means as a means of ascertaining the intent of the soul. I have one of those classic dreams which keeps giving me a proverbial kick up the backside in terms of my spiritual efforts, in that it's absolutely repeated in that I'm at university, or it may actually be at secondary school in the final year. It can vary. And I have 3 subjects, and 2 of them I do not have a hope of passing. I just haven't done enough work, so I have to concentrate on one. And the amount of times I have that, every few months I will have that particular dream. So I've mentioned then constructing the Antakarana, controlling desire, integrating our personality. And as I said earlier, when we tread the path, we do it for humanity and for the planetary consciousness. When we tread the path, when we bring down the qualities of the higher self, we are also metaphorically watering the other lotuses on the lake of Sakavati. So let's go on. I've been doing quite a bit of work on the voice of the silence of late. I've decided I'll stop at fragment 1. I'll obviously study the other 2, but I've just about got my first draft there. But a verse which I found was absolutely beautiful is this particular one, about one who is self-realized after undertaking the various disciplines, passing through the halls of ignorance, learning, and wisdom. 'Tis only then thou canst become a walker of the sky, who treads the winds above the waves, whose step touches not the water. So the phrase walker of the sky, in my humble opinion, it's what the symbol evokes to me, represents a functioning of spirit free from its material constraints. Of course, this is a very highly advanced evolutionary stage after the soul is liberated from the wheel of rebirth. Christianity describes the miracle of Christ walking on water. The Buddha levitates over the Rahini River and he teleports across the river Ganges. Each avatar here is a walker of the sky. The symbolism in these instances illustrates that spirit, when realized, travels over the sea of Maya. Here is an image of another of my favorites, Joseph Campbell. Why am I mentioning this? You will see very shortly. Campbell illustrates how the various myths of our world illustrate a single story of humanity and our strivings towards realizing our divine potential. Campbell emphasized that every myth is psychologically symbolic, and its narratives and images are not to be assumed as literal, but rather as metaphors. And he adopted a comparative approach towards interpreting mythic symbolism, perceiving a common pattern underlying its narrative elements. There is an image of the hero with 1,000 faces. This outlines what Campbell describes as the hero's journey, a representation of the spiritual path, this being a motif of adventure and personal transformation employed within the mythical framework of many cultures. The filmmaker George Lucas is an avid admirer of Campbell's writings, and he employed Campbell's hero's journey and various stages of the journey as a model for his epic opera Star Wars. And I would suggest that it's perhaps more than coincidence that the questing protagonist in these adventures is named Luke Skywalker. Just a thought, it jumped out at me when I was reading Voice of the Silence, and I knew there was an association between Campbell and George Lucas.